Okay, well, good morning everyone. We're going to start the webinar now. Welcome to this free webinar from the Deltaee Energy and Environment Heat Pump and Micro-CHP Research Services. Just before we start, we've just got a couple of housekeeping points. Firstly, just like to say we're very happy to take questions as we go through the webinar, and there'll also be time at the end where we'll try and address them. You'll be able to see on the right of the screen, hopefully, a grey dialog box. And down at the bottom, there's a question box where you can submit your questions by typing them in. If we don't have time to answer everybody's questions today, then don't worry, we'll be producing a write-up of the questions and answers and sending them round afterwards. We'll also be doing a couple of polls today to gauge your interest in some of the topics that we're talking about. And again, we'll circulate those afterwards as well. So our topic today, as you'll know, is looking at the nearly zero energy building regulations and looking at whether this is going to catalyse change in the heating market in Europe from 2021. So presenting to you today are myself and my colleague, Mr. Lucas Bergman.
Hello.
Lucas is a senior analyst here at Deltaee Energy and Environment, and he manages the Heat Pump Research Service. My name is Kate Lyon, and I mostly work on the Micro-CHP Research Service. And Lucas will tell you a little bit more about those two services shortly. So we're holding this webinar today because the requirements around energy in buildings is going to be changing in Europe from 2021. And we believe this is going to have a strong impact on the market for different heating systems. However, as we'll show you today, there is still a lack of clarity around what this change will look like and what this could mean for the different technologies. And we know this is a big issue that's on the minds of the subscribers to our research services. So based on feedback we've had from them and discussions with industry, we've begun research for a new report. We're going to be looking into the topic of nearly zero energy buildings and what this might mean for different manufacturers, different developers, different players in the industry. And we want to take this chance to show to a wider audience our evidence for, one, why we think the nearly zero energy buildings are going to have a big impact on the European heating market. Two, some of the key questions we'll be looking to address. And three, demonstrating the approach that we'll be taking using modelling, facts and evidence to try and answer some of these questions. And it's worth saying that in the webinar today, we'll only be focusing on residential new build. However, nearly zero energy building regulations will also affect the non-residential and commercial sector. So if you have any questions on that, please do send them in, and we'll also be covering those in the report. So before we get started on the content, I'd just like to hand over to Lucas to tell those of you who don't know Deltaee Energy Environment a little bit more about us.
Thank you, Kate, and good morning to everybody from me as well. Before we get started with today's topic, please let me say a few words about the company we work for, Deltaee Energy and Environment. At Deltaee, we are experts in heat and distributed energy, and we are focusing on everything related to the demand side of the energy triad. We provide our clients with market insight and forecasts, techno-economic analysis, competitor benchmarking, as well as strategy and tactics support. We do all this across a wide range of different topics, which are all in one way or another linked to the demand side of the energy system. Two technologies that are covered by our dedicated research services and which link the energy sector with the built environment are heat pumps and Micro-CHP, which will be our focus today. At Deltaee, we have a global client base with a focus on the European markets, and we're quite proud to say that we count all major players of the HVAC world amongst our clients, as well as Europe's largest utilities. Other sectors we regularly work for are the finance sector and policy and NGOs. Another fact that makes us proud is that more than 70% of our business is repeat business, showing the great trust our clients have in the value and quality of our research. The information that we present you today is taken from our upcoming study on new build in 2021, which is a collaboration between our heat pump and Micro-CHP research services. Our services help our clients to identify and exploit market opportunities, understand emerging markets and technologies, as well as key policies. They are an easy way to make sure that you stay up to date on developments in your industry and save you time by providing you with the key messages behind current developments. And with this being said, I will hand the microphone back to Kate for a short setting of the scene.
Okay, thanks, Lucas. So, little introduction to the topic. Why are we looking at this? And why is Europe looking at requiring nearly zero energy buildings? So these are some statistics that we'll expect many of you will have heard before, but they are worth repeating. That buildings are a significant source of carbon dioxide emissions and major users of energy. Homes, offices, shops, other buildings account for nearly 40% of final energy consumption in the EU and around 36% of greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, reducing energy use in buildings is going to be a key part of the EU's energy efficiency policy. The main legislative instrument the EU is using to bring about a change in the building sector is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, or EPBD, which aims to significantly improve the energy efficiency and total energy consumption of buildings throughout the EU. And a key part of the EPBD is the requirement for member states to ensure that by 31st of December 2020, all new buildings are nearly zero energy buildings. And nearly zero energy buildings are defined in the regulations as a building that has a very high energy performance. The nearly zero or very low amount of energy required should be covered to a very significant extent by energy from renewable sources. So that's clearly quite a broad definition, and member states are going to be drawing up their own national plans to define what nearly zero energy means to them. But before we go and look at that, the question that was on our mind is, how much impact do new build regulations typically have on heating markets? And here's where I'm going to hand back to Lucas to talk you through why we think there's strong evidence to show that they do.
Thanks, Kate. So what's the impact of building regulations on the market? We think that it's huge, and I would like to support this view with some evidence. Let's look at Germany, for example. On this graph, you see the shares of different heating technologies in new residential buildings in Germany over the last 15 years. As you can see, heat pumps, for example, have grown quite significantly in this period. It's the green part of the chart. They have grown to a share of more than 30% of this market in just over 10 years. At the same time, especially gas technologies have lost significant market share, even more so than oil. This is important because gas, until the end of last year, used to be the cheaper fossil fuel of the two. So that leads us to believe that economics are not likely to have been the only driver of this development. And indeed, the chart gets a little more interesting if we look at what has happened to the building regulations. The first jump in market share of heat pumps from less than 2 to more than 3% happened in 2001 to 2002, when the first version of the NF, the German Energy Savings Ordinance, came into effect. After a quite sluggish first few years, the market was then kick-started by the very strong increase in fossil fuel prices in the mid-2000s. The introduction of the second iteration of the NF in 2009 kept the share for heat pumps in the new build market on the rise, despite worsening energy price ratios between electricity and fossil fuels. But as you can see, the drive from the NF 2009 has almost come to a halt in 2013-14, as the market has found its new equilibrium and as the rising electricity prices and falling fossil fuel costs are putting heat pumps under more and more pressure. Nevertheless, we expect to see heat pumps gaining more market share again from 2016 onwards, with an even bigger jump in 2017. The reason for this is that the latest version of the building regulations, which were introduced in 2014, will give heat pumps a much stronger position from 2016 onwards, and we expect to see the full effect of these changes on the market with a lag of about 1 year. This lag of 1 year between tightening of the building regulations and the market response is a characteristic which we have recently also seen in another market, namely France. In the last 10 years, France has twice introduced new building regulations. The first round, in 2005, was not strong enough to lead to a significant increase in sales of heat pumps into the new build sector. The significant market growth, which you can see in the second half of the 2000s on this chart, was driven by very strong subsidies in the retrofit segment. But the introduction of the second set of new build regulations, with a reduction in energy demand to less than half of the previous amount, and a mandatory share of 10% renewable energy have had a quite different effect. The regulations, called RT 2012, came into effect on the 1st of January 2013. They apply to all building permits requested on or after this date, which explains the gap of 1 year between the coming into force of the regulation and their strongest effects on the market. And indeed, if we look at the split in sales of space heating heat pumps between new build and retrofit, we see that sales into the new build market have increased by close to 100% in the last year. This evidence from two of Europe's largest heating markets makes us confident that tightening building regulations will indeed catalyze change in the composition of heating system sales into new build from 2021 and maybe even earlier. But the question then is, where are we heading, and what solutions will stand most chances of being successful?
Yep, thank you very much, Lucas. It's a very good question. So we've seen where we've been, and the question now is, where are we going to be going in the future? And this is one of the key things we'll be exploring in the report. As we saw previously, the definition of nearly zero energy building from the EU is quite flexible. There's currently no single harmonised definition, and the individual member states are responsible for defining in their own national plans what constitutes a nearly zero energy building. One of the things we can see already is that some of the member states are further along the journey of defining it than others. Based on what we know, there's also a wide range of definitions emerging. So at one end of the spectrum we have Austria, which is proposing to allow up to 160 kilowatt hours of primary energy per square metre per year in residential buildings. And at the other end of the spectrum we have Denmark, who are down at just 20 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year. Then we also have the case of France. Now, France has set a maximum limit of between 45 and 60 kilowatt hours, but they are also trying to implement an energy positive requirement for all new buildings, which they're defining at the moment. The UK is doing something different again. They are mostly basing their standards on carbon dioxide reductions and energy costs. Germany, it has also yet to be defined, but we're expecting it to be close to or based on the passive house standard. And in Italy, the picture isn't totally clear either. There are also different opinions coming up on how to measure nearly zero energy. So is it based on primary energy? Is it based on CO2 reductions? Should you be aiming for energy positive or for passive house? What does on-site mean in terms of cogeneration and renewables? And should the amount of renewable energy or cogeneration be defined in a qualitative way or in a quantitative one? It's our understanding that the EU is also considering whether to harmonise regulations across all member states. So in our report, we'll be focusing specifically on the countries of UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Denmark. And what we'll be looking to answer are, what do we think are the most likely ways that nearly zero energy building will be defined in these 5 key countries, if they aren't already? What do we think these definitions will mean for the viability of different heating systems in member states? And specifically, what do we think they'll mean for heat pumps and for Micro-CHP? So before we move on to that, we've got our first poll question for you. This is a slightly tricky one to start you off with on a Friday morning, which is, given that the EU is considering whether to harmonise nearly zero energy building regulations across the EU, which measure of efficiency do you think should be used? Should it be maximum primary energy? Should it be total CO2 emissions? Should we look at using non-dimensional use coefficients? Or is there something else? So we'll give you a few seconds to vote on that poll, and it'll also stay open for a little while after that while Lucas continues. And you can also use your chat box and your questions box to ask us any questions and give us some reasoning.
So, as Kate mentioned, partly due to the lack of clarity about the exact design of the future regulations, there is a whole set of questions the heating and building industry are facing. How much further can we reduce the energy demand in buildings by structural measures? What role is there for non-intermittent small-scale generation? And how can we keep homes affordable? And last but not least, what about cooling? Currently, we think that there is no consensus on these questions yet in the industry. But throughout our discussions to date, we have identified 3 major directions of travel which people think possible. On the one end of the scale, we see people arguing that nearly zero energy buildings will be the demise of wet distribution systems, and that the future of heating our homes are heat recovery ventilation systems with heat pumps, their advantage being that they can heat and cool the building and don't require an additional distribution system on top of the ventilation. On the other end of the scale, we see people saying or agreeing that there will be no more wet distribution systems, but they say that it could be that energy demand is reduced to such low levels that we will see the return of direct electric heating, most likely combined with solar thermal and PV, in order to offset the residual energy demand of the building. And then another group of people thinks that in terms of the distribution system and the technologies, things will largely remain business as usual due to comfort reasons and habits. In their mind, the future will mainly bring more heat pumps as well as controllable small-scale generation such as fuel cells with their very high electrical efficiency. Both might be combined with one or another form of solar technologies such as solar thermal and PV. Having presented you these possible scenarios for the future of heating in new build, I would be interested in knowing what you think will be the most successful approach in meeting nearly zero energy requirements in 2021.
So we've got another poll coming up for you. We are going to ask you to vote on what you think is going to be the technology which is going to be most successful in achieving nearly zero energy building goals in new build dwellings. And we've got a choice for you of, is it going to be heat pumps? Is it going to be micro-CHP fuel cell? Are we going to have solar thermal, possibly with PV and direct electric heating? Is it going to be exhaust air heat pumps? Or again, is it going to be something else? So you can put questions in the chat box. If you've got any comments, anything that you'd like to say about your reasoning, and we'll leave the poll open again. We'll give you about 10 seconds and then we'll get on to the next bit.
Okay, so thank you very much for voting, and we now want to look at how Deltaee and the teams of our heat pump and Micro-CHP research services will go about providing some answers to the questions that we have just raised. Well, one reason why we are holding this webinar is our upcoming report on New Build 2021 and the consequences of nearly zero energy building regulations on our respective heating technologies. In this report, which will be published at the end of January 2016, we will deliver a consistent overview of how nearly zero energy buildings are likely going to be defined in our 5 core countries. We will then combine this view with a model-based approach, which will allow us to compare the performance of different combinations of heating systems, add-on technologies, and building envelopes in meeting the likely nearly zero energy building requirements in the different countries, just as well as their economic performance. And ultimately, we want to provide you, our readers, with our view on which products we think you should develop and, maybe even more importantly at this stage, in which directions you should influence regulations in order to maximize the opportunity for your technology. In order to deliver these results, we are on the one hand currently starting our range of in-depth interviews with experts from the heating industry, the building industry, for example, developers, architects, or energy experts, but also policymakers and influencers, in order to provide us with a good overview of the likely definitions of nearly zero energy buildings and the necessary parameters of technology options. This information will then feed into our model, which we are currently building, which will use information such as the country and the climate zone, but also the building parameters, in order to determine the energy demand of likely nearly zero energy buildings. We will then test the performance of different combinations of building and technology options, which could, for example, include fuel cells with or without solar thermal support, heat pumps with or without photovoltaics, or even the direct electric solution mentioned before. The outcomes of the model will then be compared against their fulfillment of the different nearly zero energy buildings criteria, as well as amongst each other based on their economic performance.
Okay, and before we wrap up and conclude, another question that has been on our mind is whether or how easy it's going to be to make the transition to nearly zero energy buildings. And besides a lack of clarity over how it's going to be defined at the moment, we're interested to hear your opinion on what you think is going to be the biggest challenge for meeting nearly zero energy building targets. So is it going to be down to the cost of the technologies? Is it due to a lack of available technologies? What do you think customer engagement is going to be like? Is it going to be down to a lack of buy-in from across the supply chain? Again, your chat box is open if you want to give us any comments or any questions, and we'll give you a few seconds to vote on that poll.
Okay, thank you very much for voting. We will now continue to the summary and conclusions. So, as we have shown you in this webinar, there is strong evidence from markets like Germany and France, but I could also cite the mandate to have condensing boilers in the UK, that building regulations have a very strong impact on heating system sales. We are confident that nearly zero energy buildings will have further significant effects on how we build and heat our homes in the future. Nevertheless, at this point in time, there is still a lack of clarity around definitions of nearly zero energy buildings and eligible solutions. Deltaee will bring answers to some of the burning questions of the industry by using a model-based comparison of technology options and combining this with views on likely outcomes of policy discussions from our wide network of European industry experts. And with this, I would like to open the floor to the questions. Unless you have already done so, please ask us any questions that you would like us to answer. We will see if we can answer some of them right away, and if not, we will include all of them in our write-up of the webinar, which we will send out to you via email later today. Okay, so thank you very much. We have got several questions here. One quite interesting one is whether the model will also look at hybrid solutions. And I can confirm that we will look at hybrid solutions, especially in terms of hybrid heat pumps, which will be one of the technologies that we will look at. Another question that we were asked was whether we were just limiting our analysis to heat pumps and micro-CHP. And this question is, well, or needs to be answered with no, because we will also model some alternative options, like have a look at whether the standard gas boiler could still be an option, or what it would need to be done in order to still use it in new build from 2021 onwards, just in order to compare this with the effect this might have on our technologies. Obviously, heat pumps and micro-CHP are the core focus, but we do want to benchmark these two technologies against some other options which might be possible. We have one question here with regards to the expected maximum heat demands of these buildings in terms of kilowatts. This is a question that we are still exploring. We are currently building the model, and we will use load coefficients from the Energy-Related Products Directive in order to determine the load hours, and we will also sense check the results of the model through interviews with industry experts. So it's something that we will look at, but we are currently not yet able to answer this question. Another question asked about the modeling was whether we were looking at gas and electricity heat pumps or only electricity heat pumps. And the plan is to look at both technologies. If not at this stage, then certainly at a later stage once we come to a review of this report.
Okay, we've had another question which I think is around the existing buildings. So in this report we are just going to be looking at the effect on new builds, but you're right, that's a very good question. The nearly zero energy building regulations do also currently cover significant retrofit, a significant improvement to retrofit stock. So we would expect to see something happening in existing buildings from 2021. Again, that will vary by member state and how they decide to define it and how much they think it's reasonable of them to ask.
Based on latest discussions in Brussels, we also understand that the European Commission is looking to support measures in the retrofit sector. Whether it will go as far as mandating renovations, for example, in retrofit, we currently don't think that this is likely. But if we look at the situation, we think that from 2021 onwards, there won't be much left in terms of efficiency gains in the new build sector. So in order to really decarbonize buildings in Europe, once we are at nearly zero energy buildings, the focus of attention will definitely have to turn to the retrofit sector, whether that would be through support schemes or through mandated minimum requirements for renovations. Okay, so the last question with which I would like to wrap up this webinar was about when we will have the results out of the poll and also the report. The results of the polls will be included in the email that you will receive after this webinar, which will also include two links. One link to a YouTube recording of this webinar, and also a link to a second webinar, which we will hold in early February after we have published the report, and which will summarize some key findings of the report. With that, I would like to thank you very much in the name of Deltaee and the team of the Heat Pump Research Service and Micro-CHP